We can be moving and be in God's rest. And in fact, most of the time, we probably should be. In the book of Exodus, a book all about being on the move, in chapter 33, God says to God's people, you need to get moving again. Because God's people had just sinned and made a golden calf as their idol. And God says in verse 14, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. The Israelite people were only going to find their rest once they got back on the road, heading in the direction that God had planned for them. Some of you may know the restlessness of standing still and resisting the promptings of God's will in your life. The key to experiencing God's rest is God's grace at work in our lives. A few weeks ago, Pastor Chris described God's grace as God's unmerited, undeserved love and favor for God's people. And one of the most exciting parts of God's grace in our life is how God's grace transforms our lives and our hearts. When we choose to seek out and surround ourselves with encounters of God's grace, our hearts are transformed, and our perspective on the world is shaped to match God's kingdom. We recognize where God is moving and calling on us to participate in that movement. We also are better able to recognize where our own temptations and our desires to try and find our own rest and our own assurance would have held sway for us before. And God helps us to see through the facade and stay in God's will. Through the lens of Wesleyan theology that we claim as United Methodists, this movement of God's grace is what we call sanctifying grace. Sanctifying grace is how God transforms our hearts to be more like Jesus. And when we remain surrounded by that grace in God's rest, then that transformation is a continual and progressive process. And we are better equipped every single day to seek after God's will and leave the false promises of past temptations behind. As we close this morning, I want to return to our opening illustration of learning to swim. Simply being able to float is not the end goal. We want to swim. We want to explore our horizons, pursue our passions, make a difference. But we do all that with the awareness that when we rest, when we hold ourselves in the correct posture, our head stays above water. Learning to swim with the knowledge that we are meant to live, with the knowledge and the assurance that we can float is a completely different ballgame. We're meant to live this life with the knowledge that God's grace is at work in our lives, that God loves us, and Christ's salvation is available to us by faith alone, by trusting not in anything that we can do on our own, but in the completed work of Jesus. If that's how we enter the water to swim, then we swim with freedom, with joy and pleasure in God's creation. But if all we're ever doing is keeping our own head above water, without any awareness of what may come or what might happen if our own efforts fail, without any possibility of rest or assurance, we flail. We grasp at anything that we think may sustain us. We put idol after idol in front of ourselves, but ultimately we wear out. We lose our vitality. Just like the idols we tried to focus on lose their luster, and we sink. If we want to be able to rest in God with the freedom and joy that comes with it, we have to choose to put ourselves in the posture of receiving and living into God's grace.